Hello. This week we come to the 23rd week of the liturgical year. And as always, we begin by noticing what the readings for this time are. First reading comes from the book of the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 33, verses 7 through 9, so 3 verses. Once again, a section from the letter of Paul to the Romans, this time chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. And the gospel passage comes from Matthew, chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. Now, we have been following the story of Matthew, but since last time, when we were in chapter 16, we have now moved to part of chapter 18. So maybe again, putting things into perspective as the author of this gospel saw his story, I'd like to fill in the parts that will lead up to the section that we're going to hear this time. You remember that we ended last time with Jesus having predicted that he would be going up to Jerusalem and there things wouldn't go so well before him. And Peter had stepped in and said, "No, Lord, you shouldn't do this." And Jesus had corrected him. And then Jesus said, "Unless one is willing to take up their cross and follow me, they cannot be part of my kingdom or the kingdom of heaven. And what good is it to gain one's whole life and to lose one's eternal soul?" All right, so all of that brought pretty much to an end chapter 18. So what I would like to kind of just quickly summarize is what happens in chapter 17 that we will not be hearing or that we have heard parts of already. Chapter 17 begins, the first 13 verses, with the story of the Transfiguration. Now, we have looked at the Transfiguration, in fact, twice this current year, one on the actual feast of the Transfiguration on August the 6th, and then one on the second Sunday of Lent. So we have examined and explored the meaning of the Transfiguration, but one again notices that episode occurs right after the sayings that we have just mentioned. So although there will be difficulties and heartaches in accepting the message of the Lord, there is also the glory that will come when Jesus is transfigured or raised from the dead. Verses 14 through 20 of chapter 17 are the picture of the disciples come to him. A boy has been moonstruck and suffers terribly. And the disciples, someone had brought their boy to the disciples to be healed, were unable to do it. And they asked Jesus now why they could not cast out the demon or the evil spirit from this boy. And Jesus' response to them is, well, this happens because of little faith, your little faith. And then gives an interesting little analogy. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could see how great it would be. And then he makes allusion to a mulberry tree. You could root up a mulberry tree and throw it into the sea if you had sufficient faith. Now, in case you're not sure about what a mulberry tree is and why that image is used, I think we have looked at it once before. Keep in mind that the root system of a mulberry tree is twice the size of the actual tree. So it is very, very extensive, very, very involved. And so the idea of rooting it up, you can see why the example becomes interesting and why it is used. Verse 21, by the way, has Jesus say that, and we're not sure whether this wasn't a little addition put into Matthew's gospel, this kind of healing can only be achieved by prayer and fasting. Many interpreters rather look at this and say that the idea of fasting was added to this text, that can only achieved by prayer? Well, that's a kind of interesting discussion, but I just mentioned it in passing. Verses 22 through 27 present the second passion prediction that Jesus gives. As we mentioned, there will be three of them, so we will only hear, one of them in terms of our weekend reflection. They are basically the same with some slight additions that are made. Now, this is followed by the question of what is known as the temple tax. And Jesus asks his disciples whether or not they need to pay the temple tax. Now, it's all well and good to remember that the temple tax was levied by the authorities who were ruling and taking care of things up in Jerusalem in order to keep the temple area going and take care of the costs that were developed in keeping the kind of place, the whole temple, in good order for visitors, especially for when the great feast occurred. The only difficulty here is the question, as Matthew presents it, as to whether or not we should pay the temple tax, is a reminder that when Matthew wrote his gospel, the temple didn't exist anymore. It had been destroyed, you remember, in the year 70. And so the tax in Matthew's time is still being levied, but this time the money is going to Rome. So Rome has kind of encouraged or supported the temple tax, but it doesn't go for the keeping up of the temple, but it goes into the coffers of Rome, who were, of course, by this time running things in the Holy Land in a much stronger way after the defeat of the uprising that had happened in 66 to the year 70. All right. Now, by the way, this little episode is a curious piece. What takes place next, it is the only time in the gospel tradition that we find this story. And many think that perhaps, now what happens is that Jesus raises this, is pictured as raising this question with his disciples. Are we to pay it because we are bound, or are those who are free obliged to pay for this, give this tax? Well, they say if you're free, you're not obliged to give the tax. But Jesus says to Peter, so that everything will go kind of well with us and with the authority, go down to, now we assume that it is the Lake of Gennesareth or the Sea of Galilee, and go fishing, and the first fish that you catch, he says to Peter, haul it in, open its mouth, and there you will find a coin, okay? A shekel. Now, a shekel equals about 4 denarius. That would be about, 4 days worth of pay. Take that coin, and that should be enough for you and for I in order to pay the tax. Now, that's the story. It's a kind of a little parable in its own way. Certainly, it would be appealing, if you thought about it, to Peter and his background, because it's a fish story. And those of you who are fishermen know that they tend to tell stories that sometimes are a bit exaggerated. Now, can you imagine going fishing, catching the first fish, and when you open up its mouth, there is this coin, appropriately given the amount that you need in order to pay for the tax. So there is also certainly a little bit of humor in this story. Now, why is it included here? Well, some say that perhaps once again it reinforces the special position of Peter, because Jesus tells Peter to do this, Peter does it, and Peter acts in behalf of Jesus and himself. So remember, throughout the Matthean Gospel, Peter emerges often in little stories that are remembered about him, certainly as demonstrating leadership qualities and having this kind of unique relationship with Jesus as now his journey toward Jerusalem, and really throughout his ministry has had. So that's the story, the fish story, the paying of the tax. Now it's chapter 18. This is where we're getting a section this time. It's chapter 18. The first 14 verses are missing. And let's look a little bit at that. The question is raised by someone, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now again, remember that phrase, kingdom of heaven, is an important one in the Matthean tradition. And the question says, who is the greatest? So it's not talking just about disciples, but it's talking really in a much broader way as the question is phrased. What Jesus does is he brings a child into their midst. Now, we have noticed this on other occasions. A child who remains that till about the age of 12 or 13, when one merges from being a child to an adult. We have noticed in the past there are only two stages in life for a person, that of child and that of adult. There's no young adults, no teenagers. None of that is part of the world of the Mediterranean time and of Jesus' time. So a child, therefore, is important to notice that it has, or they have, or she has, no social status or any political significance. A child, in some ways, by one other author, is described as having no other benefit or role than that of a slave. If you're talking about someone who has rights and privileges and could be defended by the tradition, well, technically, that only was given to adults. Now, I'm not saying that children weren't treated kindly and with respect, but as we have noticed on other occasions, childhood was a very difficult time for a person growing up. Child death after the first critical 40 days was often very high. So survival required health reasons, but also other reasons. So when Jesus brings a child into his midst and says, well, who is the greatest? Keep in mind that they all get it. The child is really what we would call a social nobody, has no rights or respects. To become like a child, therefore, challenges, if you think about it, cultural assumptions about social status. Is Jesus, by this action, actually raising children or childhood up to be respected in the same way as the rights and privileges of adults should be? Some make that case. We're unsure here, but we certainly understand the implication that Jesus is sending by saying that if you want to be one of the greatest, you must become like a child. It certainly is a wonderful example of what we call humility, where one is, the very word means close to the ground, without, therefore, all of the regulated privileges that belong to others. This is then followed, so we're looking at the first 14 verses, but in verses that now follow, Jesus cautions about giving scandal to a child. If you give scandal to a child, it would be worthy of the one who gives scandal that a millstone would be tied around their neck and they would be thrown into the water. Now, a millstone, you remember, was a huge stone which was used, they would move it around to grind grain, okay? It was a way in which they got rid of the part that wasn't too good or healthy, and kind of wound up with the flour, we would say, to make for the baked goods and things like that. So a millstone was a rather large stone, to say the least, and often this going around was, not humans did it, but a donkey would do it, and you see pictures of that. as it was done. So if you got one of those tied around your neck and you were thrown into the sea, it took you to the depths of the sea. So certainly you couldn't get any deeper, and you certainly would never get out. So this little parable message certainly is clear. I mean, people understood what that would be like. So do not cast or become a source of scandal to little ones. Now, I also, the phrase little ones here, although we've been talking about the fact that it refers to a child, a little one also can be understood as those who do not have social status. So it may refer not simply to one who is chronologically a child, but a little one who in culture has little or no social status or value. And often that becomes a real concern, you remember, in the message that Jesus is teaching. Now, he says, and here verses 8 and 9, I have to smile, is one that those who more literally like to interpret Scripture might find this passage a little more challenging, and it's interesting, we won't hear it on Sunday, but this weekend, but he says, if one of your limbs, if your hand is the course of scandal, cut it off. If your leg or your feet are a course of scandal, cut them off. If your eye is a cause of scandal, pluck it out. Now, if one took this very literally, there would be a lot of people in the middle of the Mediterranean world who were without a hand or without a foot or were blind out of one eye. So you get it, that the emphasis here, and that's what these two verses are, better, he says, to enter into life limbless than to suffer the flames of Gehenna, or the fire, Gehenna of fire, which was understood as the underworld, and where you would be really painfully suffering much. So don't give scandal. You see, it really is an interesting little section here, is it not, where Jesus uses, well, do we call this a metaphor? Do we call it a parable? Probably not a parable, but certainly a vivid illustration of what you better not be doing, or the consequences for doing it. And then verses 12 through 14, which leads us up to the verses that we're going to look at this time, is a little parable. It is the parable of the lost sheep, where Jesus is pictured as saying, if one loses one sheep, or as it goes astray, would not the shepherd leave behind the 99 and go and seek out the lost? Now, there is a similar kind of parable in Luke, but here it is different. And the lost sheep here, by the way, would be a member of the Matthean community. So it is, and we'll look at this in a moment now, really an insider issue, okay, that is being concerned. So someone of concern. So someone who has been a believer of Jesus, or in his ways, or in the message of the kingdom of heaven, has gone astray. Someone, and like the good shepherd, would go and seek that one out, leaving behind the other 99. So in this little parable, leaving behind the 99 is not an unhealthy thing to do, because the 99 are the faithful believers. See, they're going to stay together, not like sheep who wander around, but because they are a community. So in that sense, it's wise on the part of the shepherd to leave the 99 and to go in search of the lost, to bring that member back to the community. The hope here is for a full community, a wholesome community. All right. So that really leads us now, this story and these episodes lead us to what we look at this time, which, as we mentioned, are verses 15 through 20. Here, the issue arises with regard to, well, the word is used sin, but keep in mind here, in this gospel, and that is really what we've been kind of stressing as we go along here, that sin is against another person in the community, and it has to do with the honor that is due to that person. So sin is not taken in the often used way that we have noticed, and that's important to recognize that. But here, sin is seen as something which dishonors a fellow believer. So once again, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a story involving insiders, those who are already believers in the message. And this would be a situation certainly that would have existed, well, maybe in Jesus' time, but certainly by the time that Matthew writes his gospel. So how does one deal with a fellow believer who brings about a situation that could and did bring dishonor and shame to one of the messages, one of the messengers, one of the believers? All right. What is given in this little section now are 3 strategies for conflict resolution. So that sounds kind of popular today, but that's really what this section is arguing here. So it says if you've committed a sin against a brother, as I mentioned, this is a member of the church, okay? Now, sometimes we generally say any brother or sister, but here it has really a specific understanding. And the advice here is given to head off a conflict between insiders. It is not intended to cover relationships with outsiders. See, that's the point that I've been kind of stressing here as we look at this. So how does the church, and by the way, it's only in this section for the second time that the term church is used. You remember the first time was when Jesus had been pictured as giving to Peter the keys of the kingdom. So really there is a threefold stage or step here of how you do this. The first is that you should go to the other person who you have shown dishonor to the offended party, and to confront him or her in private. Now, what Matthew often does, we've noticed this in other cases, rely on sections from the Hebrew scripture in order to develop his understanding of Jesus and his message. So in this first instance, it looks like the author has gone to the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 17, which reads, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with your neighbor, lest you bear sin because of him." So that seems to be the kind of text that this first thing that the person who is in tension with another should do, that it should be privately done. If resolution can be achieved, so much for the better. That will bring that person back into unity. Keep in mind, too, that this strategy is connected with that little parable that we just mentioned about the lost sheep. See, this is one of the things when we just take sections, we lose these connections, but I would suggest that looking at it more carefully, we see that there's a natural flow and continuance of a discussion or an insight that Jesus is presenting. Now, So someone thinks that another person has shown dishonor, the offended party should confront the sinner in private. That's the first step. The second step, if that doesn't work, well, then get 2 witnesses. Now this seems to come from the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 19, which reads, "Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall a charge be sustained." And it presupposes, by the way, a criminal offense, not a problem within a community. But so that's what needs to be done here. You now take the 2 people, the one who is offender and the one is offended, with 2 witnesses from the community and see if this is kind of semi-private, but now it becomes a legal matter, and whatever they decide, whatever the witnesses decide, becomes legally binding. So the problem could be solved or concluded here if the offended accepts the decision of the witnesses. Now, if this doesn't work, finally we come to the 3rd stage, which engages in the cultural values of honor and shame. This time, the church, that is the entire community, is brought into the discussion. The event now becomes fully public and publicized. And so now, when you think of the church, please maybe don't even think of the number that appear at Mass on Sunday or the weekend, but think of really maybe a community made of 30 people or maybe even less. Now, even then, it might be difficult to kind of come up with a conclusion, but please do not think of huge numbers. But nevertheless, the issue is now brought to the attention of the church, and the church, that is, again, the people who make it up, become the final arbitrators of the issue, okay? Keep in mind that lying behind all of this is the issue of shame and honor. If the offender chooses to disregard the community's judgment, then the consequence is, interestingly, excommunication. That member is cut off from the community and is to be considered, interestingly, as a Gentile or tax collector, and therefore considered as an outsider. And that goes to what we mentioned before. So it's important to notice that in this world there is fierce allegiance to community, and if one is kind of put out of a community, they are considered to be effectively dead. They have no network, no support, no hope, and to be lumped with one's enemy is the worst of punishments. So that all lies as the process by which conflict resolution is to take place. Verse 18 says, "Whatsoever you shall bind," and here the decision of binding and loosening is given to the disciples at large. So before it looked like it only was given to Peter. Here it's given to the community. So if they extend forgiveness, well, then the forgiveness is given, but if it is not, then it is not. Verse 20, an interesting line, "Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am in their midst." An interesting little phrase. And therefore, when the community makes this judgment situation, Jesus is with them. So all of that is what we are given for consideration. That is the whole process of how to reconcile when one is offended. Finally, we're concluding by pointing out that Ezekiel, who was considered to be the watchman, is perhaps just given, there's a lot of stretching of this, but he's called to kind of warn the Israelites if there is danger. Watchmen kind of stood on the walls of a city and watched what was happening and offered those inside a warning and an encouragement. So I leave that with, I know there's more to be said here, but we're glad that you were with us today. Like Jesus, may we be watchmen and women for the sake of the kingdom. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.